Hello, welcome back to my channel. It's been a couple weeks, and that is partly because the semester started up. I've been trying to make sure I had all of my ducks in a row for the master's thesis, but also I fell down this sort of rabbit hole, and I haven't been able to find sources that seemed like quality material to where I was satisfied. So I made use of interlibrary loan. I kept kind of rechecking the same sources I'd already checked a dozen times, hoping I would find something new. And in the end, I feel like I came up with enough that it's really interesting. It's worth talking about. Please let me know your thoughts down below because I am getting away from what I would normally talk about in these videos. We're going to be talking about clothing on the colonial frontier of Virginia, specifically that of women. And I know, frontier Virginia, that doesn't sound too out of the box for me, but it's definitely getting a little bit closer to the work of dress historians than what I normally do. But I do think it's worthwhile, and to do this, we're going to have to talk about what women would have worn in Scotland as a representation of some of the culture that was transported with the people. It's not like they came over here and they just shed off everything they were used to and they adopted purely English customs and dress. That's not how it works. Fair warning, this is going to be long. It will be detailed, it will be full of quotes. Sorry, not sorry. But I first became intrigued after reading a quote from David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed. This is something that I've checked a number of times for different things I was researching, and it's just, I came across this one quote and I kept thinking about it. Of the Scottish, the Irish, and those from kind of the north of England near the Scottish border, who he refers to as borderers. These are people who were frequently found in the backcountry. They kind of dominated the backcountry of Virginia. Fisher wrote of them, quote, "The young women startled Quaker Philadelphia by the sensuous appearance of their full bodices, tight waists, bare legs, and skirts as scandalously short as an English undershift. The older women came ashore in long dresses of a curious cut. Some buried their faces in full-sided bonnets, others folded handkerchiefs over their heads in quaint and foreign patterns," end quote. If you're not into like historical costuming, a few of the terms in this video may seem strange. So, right off the bat, I'm going to say an English undershift, also known as just a shift or a chemise, I believe is how you pronounce it. It's just the bottom undergarment. It's going to be a plain white underdress, for lack of a better word. And that wasn't always as long as the rest of their skirts would be, because it wasn't needed for that. It's just for cleanliness, because you can have multiple shifts and switch them out after you get sweaty and dirty, but then you can rewear the rest of your clothing. So it made things easier, and it made sense. There's a few reasons I think that this quote is particularly fascinating. If you have an interest in historical clothing, obviously it's interesting to you anyway. But this also shows how existing historical accounts, they may be clouded by the perspective of wherever the person writing the account was from. People talk about the United States as being this melting pot, and they seem to think that this wasn't the case back in colonial Virginia. They think it's more recent. People coming through Ellis Island and since then, but it actually goes back. It was the case all along. There are Puritans in New England, not everyone knows that, right? But New York was originally New Netherlands, and it was Dutch before the English were able to capture it. Obviously there's Quakers in Pennsylvania. They were also in part of Jersey. Now we call it New Jersey. There were wealthy landowners that had been in the West Indies, and they bought land in what's now South Carolina. So there's all these different influences and backgrounds, even from the beginning, even before we had the American Revolution. Now, in multiple colonies, especially along the frontier, you have the Scots, the Irish, and the Scots-Irish, which, by the way, Scots-Irish, which used to be called Scotch-Irish, just means that these were Scottish people who lived in the north of Ireland for a couple generations before immigrating to what's now the United States. They had various reasons for this, but Scots-Irish doesn't necessarily denote Irish heritage. It just means that they had lived there for a time. In addition to these people, along the frontier, there were also a lot of German-speaking people. Got into a discussion in a group here recently about this, and they were trying to kind of correct me and be like, oh, well, they're not all from Germany. I know. When we say German-speaking, we don't mean from the country of Germany. We mean from that part of Europe where German was the predominant language. So you're not limited to one particular country. You're just talking about that area and anyone who learned German or who spoke it. These are the people that came over and settled along the frontier. And that is not intended. When I talk about the concept of the melting pot and everything, I do not mean to ignore the various Native American cultures and the African cultures which were also present. The only reason I didn't mention those specifically was because I think everyone knows they were here, but maybe not everyone knows that New York wasn't always an English colony, right? That's kind of new information for most people. When you get to have these varied backgrounds, you're going to have various cultural things that are imported, and this includes the clothing. So let's just jump into some of the historical accounts that I was able to find, and then we'll discuss it from there, right? First up is the Journal of Nicholas Cresswell, written between 1774 and 1777. This is a little bit later than what I really wanted to look for, but it is a source that I have seen cited multiple times as evidence that women on the frontier had a tendency to not wear stays. If you're not familiar with that term, stays were a precursor to the corset. They weren't meant for tight lacing to reduce the waist. It was meant as a source of support to help the back, help support the chest. And in his journal, Cresswell writes the following of the colonists, quote, "Their persons are in general tall and genteel, particularly the women. They are remarkably well shaped. I think I have not seen 3 crooked women in the country. Few or none of them wear stays in the summer, and there are but few that wear them constantly in the winter, which may be a principal reason why they have such good shapes," end quote. That sounds rather damning at first. But the thing is, people really don't debate that women along the coast tended to wear their stays. That's not something that becomes an issue. Well, here's the problem. Cresswell specifies that he was referring to all of the colonies south of New York. He wasn't just talking about the frontier. He was talking about everywhere. So if you're going to accept that as the truth for the frontier, then you have to reevaluate everything you're saying about the towns along the coast as well. And I don't see people doing that. So it doesn't track. And stays don't damage a woman's shape either, which is something else that I find just really weird about the quote, because he implies that the reason that these women are so well shaped is because they don't use stays. That's really irrelevant. If anything, it probably had to do with them having a better, more consistent diet here than they had in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, if they were of the poorer class. So I really don't find this journal as something that we can depend on and we can make assumptions from. I've seen a few dress historians back up this idea that the frontier women didn't wear stays, but the problem is that when I find this stated, you know what I don't find there? Citations. It's just they've decided to accept it. Whether that's because of Cresswell's writing or something else, I don't know. Then we have the observations of Charles Woodmason. Now, he was an Anglican itinerant pastor from England, so he's going to have the same assumptions that any other Englishman would have. And that's the important part right there. So he did most of his work in the Carolinas. Well, all of it, I think. Most of what I read, he was in South Carolina, but I saw that he also spent some time in what's now North Carolina. Anyway, he even says that this is exceptionally hot compared to England, and that's something you have to keep in mind. His observations were written in the 1760s, so we're getting back a little bit earlier now. And he says, quote, "It would be, as I once observed before, a great novelty to a Londoner to see one of these congregations, the men with only a thin shirt and pair of breeches or trousers on, bare-legged and barefooted, the women bareheaded, bare-legged, and barefoot, with only a thin shift and under petticoat. Yet I cannot break them of this, for the heat of the weather admits not of any but thin clothing. I can hardly bear the weight of my wig and gown during service. The young women have a most uncommon practice, which I cannot break them of. They draw their shift as tight as possible to the body, and pin it close, to show the roundness of their breasts and slender waists, for they are generally finely shaped, and draw their petticoat close to their hips to show the fineness of their limbs." End quote. Also another thing as far as terminology, nowadays we think of petticoats as being like an underskirt to support and fluff out the skirt, but back then the petticoat was the skirt. It was just a separate skirt garment. So when he's talking about them wearing a shift and a petticoat, he's not saying completely in their underwear as far as he's concerned. He's just saying just a shift and a skirt. That's what he's claiming. To Woodmason, these settlers of the backcountry, well, they're a little better than Indians as far as he's concerned. But there's also a fundamental misunderstanding at play here, and this is something that Fisher and Albion Seed actually addressed with this quote. Fisher writes that, quote, "Backcountry women dressed in what Anglican clergyman Charles Woodmason called shift and petticoat, which were its nearest equivalents in the south of England. But in fact, it was a different style of clothing altogether, a full bodice with deep décolletage, tight-fitted waist, short full skirt, and a hem worn high above the ankle. The Anglican missionary thought it scandalously revealing. Married women covered themselves more modestly in long dresses, with heavy woolen shawls draped across their head and shoulders." End quote. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that Fisher's understanding of the clothing is completely accurate either. He doesn't provide enough sources to really give me anything to go on here. But I do agree that Woodmason was assessing their clothing from the lens of someone from the south of England, which is completely different norms as far as what they would be wearing. So before I get any more into what I was able to find out about the frontier itself and what they would have been wearing, now I want to take a step further back and talk about what they would have been wearing back home in Scotland. Just as an example, like I said, there's Irish, there's people from the north of England, there's German speaking, so this is not representative of all of them, but this is just to be like, okay, now you might see where some of this is coming from, right? For example, Woodmason stresses how the backcountry settlers, they went around without shoes or stockings. Scandalous if you're from England. Or some other accounts I've read references those who on the frontier, they wore moccasins, and that's the word that gets used. To the uninformed, this sounds like one of two things: either a reflection of how poor these people were, that they couldn't afford shoes and they're being influenced by Native American culture to try to make do since they can't afford shoes. There's definitely a tad bit of truth in either of these, either influence of the Indians or lack of money for shoes, but it's far from the whole story. Another example of similar references to moccasins is Joseph Doddridge, whose narrative covered years 1763 through 1783 on the Virginia and Pennsylvania frontiers. He writes, quote, "The linsey petticoat and bedgown, which were the universal dress of our women in early times, would make a strange figure in our days. They went barefooted in warm weather, and in cold their feet were covered with moccasins, horseshoes, or shoepacks." End quote. Now he specifies that he is referring to only the first settlers of this area, says that by the second and third generations, they're far more finely dressed and wearing things that would have been seen in the towns further east in the colonies. But here's the thing. Sir Frederick Morton Eden, in his The State of the Poor, published in 1797, he wrote that, quote, "In the Highlands of Scotland, every peasant makes his own shoes, of leather of his own tanning. They are sewed with thongs of calfskin instead of hemp, both because there grows very little hemp in the country, and because the leather is more durable than the thread of hemp, not being so liable to rot from being frequently wet. They are in general made with a strength, elegance, and lightness, which one who has never seen them will not be easily persuaded to believe." End quote. So we have leather shoes of simple construction, sewn together with leather thongs, made by the wearer rather than a professional cobbler. Does this sound like anything? Anything at all? Maybe, just maybe, if you're from England and you're used to English shoes and you come to the frontier and you see these leather shoes that are customarily made in Scotland, but you didn't know that, you would make the assumption that they were copying from the Native American cultures by making moccasins, wouldn't you? I think that makes sense. I mean, it does. And on the whole barefoot, no stocking thing, yeah, it in part had to do with material wealth, probably, but it's also culture, because numerous sources establish the fact that in areas of Ireland and Scotland, it is the norm to dress like this, to go without shoes and go without stockings. For instance, Arthur Young, traveling through Ireland in the late 1770s, he wrote, quote, "The common Irish are, in general, clothed so very indifferently that it impresses every stranger with a strong idea of universal poverty. Shoes and stockings are scarcely ever found on the feet of the children of either sex, and great numbers of men and women are without them." End quote. Or, in The Social Life of Scotland in the 18th century, Henry Gray Graham explains, quote, "Even in country houses of high position, the women servants went without shoes or stockings, clad in short worsted petticoats or dresses of coarse plaiting." End quote. Also, in another spot, Graham writes, quote, "On Sundays only women wore their shoes, and so unaccustomed were they to the use of them, they seemed to hobble as they walked. So they usually carried them in their hands till they came within sight of the church, when they put them painfully on." End quote. So let's stop acting like these people, they moved out to the frontier and then they just lost all shred of civilization that they'd had to begin with, which is a rather subjective concept anyway. It's not that they were necessarily adopting Native American customs. Not that they didn't do that. I think there's other examples that we can look at for that. But in this case, it's not anything different from what they were already used to. Moving up the body, as I just mentioned in the first Graham quote, the women of this area were often noted as wearing short petticoats. This doesn't just magically happen out of the blue on the frontier because, they just don't have enough fabric. And no, I'm not confusing petticoats with later short gowns, which were a sort of bodice and didn't denote short skirts. It is what we would now call the skirts. They were often noted as being worn short even back when they were living in Scotland. Graham also describes women as having, quote, "usually no gown, but a short woolen petticoat down to the knees," end quote. The knees. So now we're getting back kind of to what Fisher was saying in Albion Seed and in what others have noted, these short skirts, which is a cultural norm if you are from Scotland. That may be one of the sources of Fisher's comment. I really don't know. The problem with a lot of these accounts is that they seem to imply a lack of material wealth without being substantiated. More importantly, they also pretend there's this lack of skill, where the people in the frontier, they just didn't know how to make anything better. They didn't know how to produce quality materials for better clothing. Because surely if you go barefoot, if you're going without stockings, it can't be intentional. To an Englishman, that can't be intentional. You see where I'm going with this? But depending on the area, the people were actually very highly skilled. In addition to describing the leather footwear, Eden's The State of the Poor describes every man of the Scottish Highlands as being a jack of all trades. He says, quote, "Many a shepherd and cotter, with his wife and children, appear at church and market neat, tidy, and even fine, in clothes which have been touched by no hand but their own, since they were shorn from the sheep and sown in the flax fields." End quote. At this point, I'm going to return to my side of the ocean and the frontier that first sent me down this rabbit hole. As early as 1739, Virginia's governor wrote that, quote, "Our new inhabitants on the other side of the mountains make very good linen, which they sell up and down the country." End quote. So that right there, as early as 1739, completely blows out of the water this idea that the people on the frontier, they just didn't have the skill set. They didn't have the ability to make anything nicer, because we know for a fact they did. The Virginia frontier was a barter society. Just because you didn't use pounds sterling or currency issued by the colonies, it didn't mean that you were lacking in material possessions. By the late 1790s, merchants in Lexington, Virginia, smack dab in the middle of what had been just the backcountry, they're selling silks and velvets. But even before that, the people were not destitute. The real problem is finding the records to establish what they did or didn't have, what they did or didn't wear in the earlier part of the 18th century. When discussing a settlement just south of Winchester, Virginia, so this would have been at the north tip of the Shenandoah Valley, the north part of the Great Wagon Road, right when they started to come south into the backcountry, Warren Hofstrom mentions some transactions involving women, which give kind of some information about clothing items. Quote, "In 1743, Rachel Hood acquired a blanket, several rugs, various textiles, petticoats, garters, buckles, a pair of shoes, and a dozen pipes from William Griffiths. During October 1750, Sarah Davis obtained ivory and horn combs from Peter Toasty, as well as thimbles, razors, broadcloth, soap, buttons, and mohair." End quote. Now, probate records are a good source of information, and it's what is used a lot of the time to establish what people had in different areas. The problem with using sources like probate records to gauge what is typical in a frontier home is that this isn't going to be representative of the poor class. It also isn't necessarily going to show items that might be deemed personal items. If a man dies, they're not going to document the shifts and petticoats and stays of his widow, because those are her personal property that she's going to be taking with her. And it's not going to be, distributed to other people. And the lack of those items on an inventory does not mean they weren't there. It just means it wasn't the sort of thing that they were going to list. Accordingly, as explained by John Stiles in his research on reported thefts in the 18th century of England, even when everyone wore stays, and we know everyone wore stays, you aren't likely to see them reported as stolen. Why? Because poor women usually only could afford one pair of stays. And if there was a theft going on, where were the stays? They were on the body of that woman. She was wearing them. So they're not going to get stolen like other extra clothing might be. But hey, let's look at the Chronicles of the Scotch-Irish settlement in Virginia, extracted from the original court records of Augusta County, 1745 to 1800. Yes, saying Scotch-Irish kind of made me cringe, but that's the title of it. What kind of clothing is mentioned in these records? Brace yourself, because it's quite a list. In 1747, Robert Breton and James Kirk reported the thefts of assorted goods, which included the following clothing items: one orange-colored sitting gown, a pale china gown, one striped blue and white cotton gown, 1 single petticoat, 1 light-colored broadcloth coat, 2 beaver hats, 1 black velvet cap, 1 blue jacket of homemade cloth, 1 hat of Bermuda plait with a red ribbon band, shifts, shirts, women's headcloths, 4 pairs of men's shoes, 3 pairs of women's shoes, and a plaid gown. In 1747 on the frontier. Then in 1756, Alexander Matheson left his rifle gun and flowered plush jacket to William Robertson in his will, and his greatcoat, coarse stockings, and coarse shirts to John Robertson. In 1758, there is recorded an agreement that John Brown would produce for David Long 200 pairs of shoes, men's and women's, and 6 pairs of boots. In 1761, a plaintiff reported the loss of a sword mounted with silver, a sword knot, a belt valued at 8 pounds, 2 pairs of silk stockings valued at 3 pounds, 2 shirts valued 5 shillings, 1 hat at 40 shillings, and 1 pair double-channel shoes at 15 shillings. 1764. Cowden versus Patrick. The defendant sold unto the plaintiff 80 pair of shoes, which were very bad, and not made in a good and workmanlike manner, but so insufficient that the plaintiff could not dispose of the same in ye camp, and by reason thereof his store got a bad character to his great damage. 1765. Crow versus Bell. Bell worked in a Stanton, Virginia shop for the owner, Mr. Crow. Bell had gifted 2 ladies a yard each of ribbon when a fair was being held in 1762. Bell had put one of the ribbons on one of the ladies' tabs and, despite implying it was a gift, and didn't record the other at all to reimburse Mr. Crow for the cost of it. There was a matter between Cowden and John Jones relating to 2 linen handkerchiefs, 1 snuff box, 2.5 yards of ribbon, 3.25 yards of some other ribbon, 4 yards of another ribbon, 7 yards checks, whatever that is, 2.25 yards calico, 7 yards thickset, 1 3/4 yards scarlet, 2 yards plush, half a yard of velvet, 11 yards of hair, 9 yards of calamanco. Hopefully I didn't butcher the pronunciation of that. And then there's the advertisement for a runaway from Augusta County on the frontier who was wearing, quote, an old felt hat, an old brown coat lined with brown linsey from the foreskirt partly torn away, a linsey jacket wanting sleeves, a shirt of a 700 knot whitened, old trousers, and had shoes tied with thongs, end quote. Obviously, I think this runaway is a man, which is not really what I'm trying to get into in this video, but did you note the description of the shoes? Shoes tied with thongs. That sounds kind of similar to the description we were given of the shoes that were made in Scotland, right? And what they're used to. Oh, this sounds like these people were destitute, doesn't it? Let's talk jewelry. There are multiple references in these 3 volumes to silver watches. Also in 1757, William Bell left his gold ring to his son. In 1760, Julian Mahoney was punished with 39 lashes for theft of a gold ring. And in 1765, John McNeil's will mentions, quote, an ancient family white stone ring set in gold, end quote, as well as a plain mourning gold ring, or rather rings, because if I understand the wording of this correctly, it sounds like he has multiple, and he left 1 to 5 different people. Finally, I want to note something that was mentioned in Anne Smart Martin's book, Buying into the World of Goods, Early Consumers in Backcountry Virginia. So she points out that, quote, when William Edis visited the mid-Atlantic colonies in 1771, he observed how quickly merchants had moved to supply the real and imaginary necessities of those who lived in the backcountry, end quote. So by 1771, they're not just getting the things that they need to have. They're getting kind of luxuries that they're imagining as being necessary, right? So what do you get from all of that? I think it's quite possible that younger women, those who hadn't married and especially they hadn't given birth yet to any children, they probably did dress to accentuate their attributes. and a support garment like stays would not have been that important. Maybe they skipped it because it didn't matter that much on the frontier, it wasn't as formal. I'm on the fence, though, about the idea of married women, even those on the younger end, not wearing stays very often, or not wearing them at all, as some have implied, because once you get pregnant the first time, I mean, excuse the description, but your boobs blow up like bowling balls. Like, you don't have the same figure you had as a teenage girl who's never been pregnant. And you need the support garment for your back while you're carrying the child while doing 100 other things, and for your chest and for everything else, you need that support garment. For the same reason that we have advertisements from, I think it was Philadelphia in the colonial period, where they're advertising stays for not just women, for men, for children, because it's a support garment. That's how it was looked at. That advertisement I didn't mention earlier because it doesn't really tell us if this was sold on the frontier, but it does tell us the perception of stays and what their purpose was in the colonies. Now, in Scotland and all, it wasn't unheard of for lower class women to have stays that were made out of leather for support instead of having boning like the stays of women in England usually would have. This may be an instance of their garments not looking exactly like what Englishmen were used to, which makes them go and say, oh, well, they don't wear stays. Maybe they did, it just looked different. We don't know. Overall, I just wanted y'all to have some food for thought. Unfortunately, I don't have the sources, the documentation to sit here and be like, well, you know, they wore this, and they wore this, and they wore this, and this is when they wore it, and I can tell you for certainty this is what was seen on the frontier. But the thing is, I don't think anyone has that. There may be people who say, oh, well, they wore this and this, but do we know that? I'm not sure we do. But the other interesting thing about this, so one of the big reasons I wanted to make a video out of this research is because I think it's a great example of what we need to watch out for when we're assessing the historical record. Because if we were just going to look at that first quote by Nicholas Cresswell, I mean, it's specific. He doesn't make any qualms about it. He specifically says, yeah, they're not wearing stays. So it would be so easy to look at a historical document in isolation and accept it at face value, but we can't do that because it's not that simple. Anyway, let me know your thoughts below. Did you find this interesting? Is there something that wasn't quite clear that I can clear up for you? If you have any sources that I didn't find that you think would be interesting for this topic, drop those in the comments as well. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe buttons if you haven't already, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye, guys.